Okay, so this all culminated in the German attempt to capture Moscow in December of 1941. Now, remember, the Germans. There are three thrusts of the German army into the Soviet Union, beginning in June of 41. The army of the north goes towards Leningrad. Ultimately, it surrounds but never captures Leningrad, and millions of the citizens of Leningrad are starved to death during World War II. Army Group Center is headed in the direction of Moscow. That was the Army group that had stalled because it had outrun its logistics in the late summer of 41, and Hitler had peeled units from it to go north and south. But it's still heading towards Moscow. But unfortunately for the Army Group Center, and thank God for the rest of us, the Russian fall comes in, muddies the roads, and then the Russian winter begins early, and the Germans had not really prepared to fight in the Russian winter. And then in the south, Army Group South is attacking what had long been Hitler's desired capture Ukraine. And then beyond that, although it's beyond his grasp at this point, and ultimately will remain beyond his grasp, the oil fields of the Caucasus, which are some of the richest oil producing areas of the world. So these three thrusts, but I want to focus on the Battle of Moscow. On October 2nd, Hitler unleashed Operation Typhoon. He felt like the Soviets had been fatally weakened, that they didn't have the strength to defend their capital, and he thought that the capture of Moscow would be a devastating blow to the morale of the Soviet Union and the Soviet people. And he thought one more push would do it. But what he didn't know is that the Soviet army, which has almost infinite number of men, had been reinforced. Almost 1 million Soviet troops were in place in October even after all the devastating defeats, even after the capture of well over 1 million Soviet prisoners of war, most of whom would die horrible deaths. The Soviet Union still had the capacity to defend Moscow, and the Germans didn't realize this. The Soviets built a multi-layered ring of defenses around the capital. Every man, woman, and child in Moscow became part of the defense of the capital. But for the most part, the citizens of Russia threw themselves into this task, especially as the word of the atrocities that the Germans were committing in the western part that they had captured. This, of course, builds up the morale and the hatred for the Germans. You know, the Germans in Ukraine, they could have actually gotten the support of the Ukrainian people, because the Ukrainian people have just been through this horrible collectivization, but they treated the Ukrainians so terribly that most Ukrainians turned against the Germans. So not only was it evil, it was stupid, it was counterproductive. And the Soviet Union just showed the people of the Soviet Union unbelievable resilience. So Operation Typhoon was this desire to finally capture Moscow. Someone mentioned this in class the other day. The same thing that Napoleon had done. You know, Napoleon did capture Moscow, but it turned out to be a Pyrrhic victory, because then he had to retreat back to France. And probably the same thing would have happened even if Hitler or the Nazis had captured Moscow in 41. Stalin just would have retreated east towards the Ural Mountains, but we don't know. But that was the goal. That was the goal. But as I said before, the German thrust, which was really predicated on mobility and speed, slowed down because of Mother Nature, because the roads, which weren't in good shape to begin with, turned into just mud, rivers of mud. And by mid-November, the temperature was dropping. Winter was really kicking in Russia that year. And ultimately, though, the Germans got to within 12 miles of Moscow. And German officers could look through their binoculars and they could see the Kremlin. They could see the towers of Moscow. And then by December 2nd, 1941, and think about what's going on. December 2nd, we're only 5 days away from the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this is like a real key moment in the history of World War II. The Germans are within 5 miles of Moscow. But on December 5th, everything went sour for the Germans in Moscow. Stalin, as I said in the previous podcast, had gotten word that the Japanese were not going to invade the Soviet Union from the east, that they were going to go south into the Pacific. He decided to believe his spy. He had an excellent spy in Tokyo at this point, and he decided to believe his spy. And he pulled his troops from the Far East under General Zhukov, and General Zhukov will become the commander of all Soviet forces during World War II. Very, very significant figure. He brings them from the eastern part of the Soviet Union, from the Asiatic part of the Soviet Union to Moscow. And on December 5th, the Soviets mount a counterattack against the German army in front of Moscow. They push the Germans 150 miles from Moscow. The Germans had been 5 miles from Moscow, but within a few weeks, the Germans are pushed back 150 miles. And the Soviet capital is saved. Now, what we're seeing here is not the defeat of the German army. The German army will certainly live to fight another day. Especially next summer, the focus of the offensive will be Army Group South towards Stalingrad. So the defeat of Operation Typhoon, the ability of the Soviets to throw back the Germans from Moscow, doesn't in any way, shape, or form mean the German army is defeated. In fact, in 1942, they probably came even closer to winning in the Soviet Union than they had in 1941. But nonetheless, what happens in December of 41 is the German army on all fronts is stopped in its tracks, which is something Hitler never expected. And as we'll talk about next week, it's right at this time that Japan bombs Pearl Harbor and the United States comes into the conflict. With all that implies, especially when it comes to Lend-Lease, the material support the U.S. was able to supply the Soviet Union. So the Germans are defeated, they're down, but they're not out. But what they thought would be a very, very quick offensive, the whole edifice of the Soviet Union would collapse, does not turn out that way, and it grows into I would call it a stalemate, but grows into a fierce war that radicalizes the situation throughout the Eastern Front and throughout the war in Europe.